Welcome to Sacred Rite, the podcast where we explore holistic living, the wisdom of ancestral traditions, and the path to deepening our connection with ourselves, one another, and the earth. Together, we will embrace wellness in all its forms and rediscover the sacred callings that guide us home. I'm your host, Amber Young. Today, we're diving into the topic that speaks to the heart of regenerative living, food forests, and perennial gardening. Powerful systems that nourish not just our bodies, but our ecosystems, our communities, and our spirits. Joining me is Brandon Dean of Healthy Homestead Designs, a permaculture designer and land steward who helps people transform their spaces into thriving, edible landscapes rooted in reciprocity and abundance. Brandon's work bridges ancient wisdom and modern application, inviting us to reimagine how we grow food, not just as a chore, but as a sacred act of connection and care. Whether you're tending a backyard garden, dreaming of stewarding land, or simply curious about how to live more in harmony with nature, this conversation is for you. So pour yourself a cup of tea, sink into the soil of this dialogue, and let's explore the beauty and brilliance of food forests with Brandon Dean. Hi, Brandon. Welcome to Sacred Rite podcast. I'm so happy to have you here today and to really talk about all the beautiful work that you're doing in the world, from permaculture to food forestry and perennial gardening. Would you please tell listeners the story behind your business, Healthy Homestead Designs, and what inspired you to start this work?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk about it today as well. So the way that I got into permaculture initially was through my own health journey, which had two interesting sides to it. When I was growing up, I was blessed with very healthy, fit parents that had high standards for their health. And at the same time, growing up in the 90s, we also led a standard American lifestyle where there was a lot of processed food. There was a variety of toxins in the environment. And when we had health issues, we were taken to the doctor, and often the symptoms were treated with drugs or surgery. So on one end, because of my healthy, fit parents, I really got into athletics and had a drive to be better and stronger and faster, and enjoyed creative expression through athletics. So I was always interested in how to become better in that field. And then at the same time, due to the standard American lifestyle, is a bit frail. So I had 8 broken bones as a kid, multiple reconstructive surgeries. Like many people, I had chronic tonsillitis and then had those removed during surgery, and also was diagnosed with ADHD and had a lot of ADHD medication throughout my childhood. So those are some of the challenging aspects. And a lot of that turned around when I met a coworker when I was a young adult who healed himself from Lyme's disease naturally after a lot of the medication that the doctors gave him wasn't working. And he introduced me to a couple books that were really important for my development. And one of those was Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price and the Weston A. Price Foundation. And that book was really profound because it's about a dentist back in the 1940s who was tired of treating patients that had issues and wanted to do research and find control groups from people that had perfect health and perfect dental structure. And it was well known that indigenous tribes all over the world had very pristine dental structures. So he went to 5 continents, 100 different countries, and studied a variety of indigenous tribes and who had near perfect teeth, and on top of that, near perfect health. And that was profound for me to learn about, because I realized that these tribes, they didn't have chronic disease, they didn't have cancer, they didn't have poverty. They had a deep spiritual connection. They had rites of passage for their kids and their community. And it was mind-blowing because up till then, I had assumed that we were the healthiest society in history because we have the best medical technology. And it totally blew my mind open that a lot of the health issues that I had and that I saw a lot of my community facing, that we didn't need to face, and it was possible to live a more connected and healthier lifestyle. And it really opened me up to holistic thinking, which was different than treating symptoms with drugs and surgery. It was, what inputs are we putting in? What air are we breathing? What water are we drinking? How are we moving? What's our spiritual connection like? So that was really positive. The other book was a book called Brain Maker, which was especially potent for me having ADHD. And that talks a lot about how fermented foods affect your gut and how your gut affects your brain. And so I started to eat a lot of fermented foods and felt this chronic brain fog that I'd had a lot of my life lift. And from then on, I became really excited and gung-ho about health and holistic health. And so that led me to sign up to a vocational college called Alderleaf Wilderness College, because I had learned that wild foods were the healthiest foods that gave you the most vitality. And one of the parts of the curriculum there was foraging wild foods. And it was such an amazing school. A lot of the days were spent in the forest, learning things such as wildlife tracking, ethnobotany, medicine making, different forms of survival skills, bird language, and bird calls. And one of them was permaculture design. So I was blessed to have a great teacher, Dave Bainline, author of Practical Permaculture, which is one of my favorite recommended intro to permaculture books for people. And that's the story of how I got into permaculture.
Thank you, Brandon. That's an incredible story. I feel like so many people get into holistic health and healing ways through experiencing some sort of dis-ease in their own bodies or something feeling out of alignment or not right. So I love how you were able to tune into really what was going to create the most vitality, and you started feeling into foods, and it's like you got little whispers to, go to Alderleaf, study food medicine, study permaculture design. That's just an incredible story. So thank you for just following your intuition and that guidance. And for folks who are new to the term permaculture, how would you define that in the simplest terms?
It's funny, in the permaculture community, it's often notoriously hard to define. So I'm going to give a few different frameworks for people to really understand it. And the first one is more of a practical definition of permaculture design. And that is, permaculture design is a scientific design process that's intended to create sustainable human habitats. And the more powerful sort of emotional, spiritual quote by Toby Hemingway, the author of Gaia's Garden, a big influence to the permaculture movement. He says that permaculture gives us a toolkit to move from a culture of fear and scarcity to love and abundance. And that's ultimately what it does. So permaculture has a design process, and it really is unique in the sense that it has ethics that come before its principles. So it's based around 3 ethics, which are care for the earth, care for people, and reinvest the surplus. And so all the principles, and everything that you do within permaculture is surrounded by those 3 ethics. And then there are, I believe, 11 primary principles that people use to implement permaculture design. And I won't go through all of them, but I'll just share some of my favorites. The first one is observe and interact. And that's a powerful one because a lot of permaculture is really about learning from nature. And to learn from nature really takes a deep observation of nature and a deep understanding of how nature works. And especially if you have your own property, really understanding all the different influences of observing the sun patterns, observing how the water moves through your property, how the wind moves through your property. Where do the birds like to spend time? Where do the squirrels like to spend time? So all of that knowledge eventually plays into a design that is harmonious with your landscape. So one of the other principles, which is really powerful and yet super simple, is catch and store energy. So it's really simple. And we think about all the different forms of energy. Those would be, an example of that would be rainwater harvesting. So water is a form of energy. And if you catch and store water, then you can use that in different ways. Plants are a form of energy. Soil is a form of energy. Animals is a form of energy. So this principle often translates to different methods such as building organic matter in your soil, creating strong soil, planting more plants, having different livestock options. Because when we have energy, when we have more resources that we can work with. And then another one is use and value diversity. So diversity is nature's way of creating resilience. So we all know that, where if you have a big monocrop with one type of plant and a pest comes and wipes the whole thing out, we no longer have resilience. But if you have a lot of diverse crops, then you can lose one or two and you still have a lot of different options. And then the last one I'll share is to use and value edges. And this is a kind of fun one where if you observe nature, you'll notice that the edges are where there's the most life. So for example, where the ocean meets the land is where there's the most seaweed, the most unique type of plants and ecosystems. Where the forest meets the meadow is where there's a lot of activity of different flora and fauna. And it's fun to take this to an interpersonal level too, and reflect on how when we personally reach the edges of our comfort zone is where there's the most growth as well.
I love it. So I want to kind of go back into like the history of permaculture. Permaculture was like a term. So historically, this has been happening for a millennia, right? Like when it comes to indigenous and ancestral food systems, these principles have just been something that has been embedded, right? Like if I think about maybe the Chaga people of Tanzania and how they maintain intensive agroforestry systems on Mount Kilimanjaro. And this represents the term permaculture was really coined by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren in the 1970s in Australia. And that's where they really brought in talking about working with nature instead of against it, like you're talking about, and then their ethical practices of earth care, people care, fair share. So that's where that term permaculture comes from. But when you think about permaculture, are you really thinking about like these historical roots? And I want to hear more about that connection and your thoughts around that.
Absolutely. That's a good point. And it's always fun to learn about North American indigenous history, because lots of people think that, as they studied what the indigenous people did here, they realized that the whole continent was kind of like a big food forest. And they really just kind of tended to the wild nature that was here to create a super abundant ecosystem. So a lot of what the founders of permaculture, the people who have popularized permaculture, talked about is looking to indigenous societies or anybody who have learned to live with the land in a way that creates more resilience and more abundance over time. So to break down the word, permaculture started as permanent agriculture. And the founders asked that question as a response to conventional agriculture, which is totally wiping off our topsoil and creating situations like the Dust Bowl. They really explored how can we create a permanent agriculture. And then that turned into permanent culture because agriculture and culture are so tightly woven together. So it really is, the beauty of permaculture is that they really took just a lot of principles and observations of how nature works and turned that into a design system that you can follow. So it's very intuitive of you to notice that a lot of these techniques go farther back than we could ever know, but are reflected in indigenous societies all over the world. But they really nailed it. He was centered down in Australia, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, and they really put together these concepts in a unique way that has allowed a lot of people to grasp them over the last 40 or 50 years.
That makes a lot of sense. It's again, bridging that ancestral wisdom and those ancestral noticings over time, like those forest gardens that were tended by indigenous tribes in the Americas. They just really had this deep understanding of plant succession and relationship, which is exactly what you're doing in your Healthy Homestead Designs, right? Is like you're understanding the land of your clients and where they live and bringing in these aspects of what just really embodies this work. And so I want to kind of get into food forests because I'm feeling really excited about this topic. And I know that food forests just embody all of these permaculture principles, right? It has like requiring minimal inputs once it's established, which is like the whole point, right? It really supports biodiversity and pollinators, like you talked about at the beginning. And now more than ever, we really need to tend to our pollinators. As you know, I don't have to, preach to the choir here, but we really need to take care of our pollinators and build healthy soil, because there's so much nutrient depletion in our soil, which is causing a depletion in our food today, which is creating like that, not helping anything when it comes to the epidemic of degenerative disease, right? When our food lacks nutrients. And we really want to create long-term food security too. So food forests really embody all of this. I want to get more into that and your thoughts about food forests.
Absolutely. Food forests. I love talking about food forests. It's one of my favorite parts of permaculture design. And a food forest is, like it sounds, it's a forest that grows food. But a more detailed definition is a food forest is a multi-layered perennial based gardening system that integrates trees, shrubs, herbs, vines, ground covers, all selected for their ability to produce food, medicine, or other resources. So as you said, it is designed to be low maintenance and self-sustaining and biodiverse. So it mimics natural forest dynamics, which is what makes it self-sustaining and self-fertilizing, where it's actually, building the soil over time. It's increasing the yields, not just food and medicine, but flowers for pollinators and any resources that you want to add to your food forest and gain from it. Food forests, like you said, they need to go through a successional phase often, because it can be challenging to try to take a somewhat barren or degraded landscape and turn it into a forest that suddenly has an established upper canopy and all the different layers. So there are techniques that you can learn from observing nature and from other people who install food forests, which is to plant these successional plants. So it's common for us to, when we're in a parking lot or somewhere with sidewalks, you see the dandelions, the plantain, the different pioneer species, as they're called, trying to come through and to essentially move the landscape into an old growth forest. At least here in the Pacific Northwest, it's kind of constantly attempting to do that. So a dandelion, for example, has a taproot that goes down deeper, breaks up compaction. It spreads its seed rapidly. It's also in a class of plants called nitrogen fixers, which are plants that have nodules on their root. They have a symbiotic relationship with this bacteria. They can actually take atmospheric nitrogen out of the air and transfer it into their roots as a way of building the soil. So when we're building a food forest, we don't need to spread dandelion seeds everywhere, but although that would be awesome because dandelions are great, but there are techniques of assessing your soil and then working on getting the soil and the environment to a place where it supports a more established forest. So this is where the role of humans can be really fun, where when we work with nature, we can really study and observe it and learn how to speed up a lot of these processes.
So cool. And so I just want to go back to that, what you said about pioneer species. And I've never heard this term, so I'm excited to hear it. You said it was like the plantains and the dandelions. They're kind of constantly working to create this system naturally, despite human roads and buildings and that sort of thing. They're just constantly working towards that.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. Next time you're in a kind of degraded landscape, you can start to see the different plants that take form there. And they're just the first people to move in and do the hard work to kind of prepare the soil and lay the groundwork for the next set of plants to come and get established.
I love that so much. And that just makes me love dandelion even more than I already do. That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that. And so you were talking about, dandelion, as we know, has this deep taproot. And you talked about pulling like stuff from the air. Are you talking about carbon sequestration when you say that?
I wasn't talking about carbon sequestration specifically. It's called nitrogen fixing plants. And so nitrogen in gardens is often an amendment that is somewhat low. So if you dig up a nitrogen fixing plant, you'll see these bulbs on their roots where they can take nitrogen out of the air and then bring it through their roots and transfer it to the soil. So then it's available for plants around them. And in a food forest, you almost always want nitrogen fixers in your guild, which a guild or polyculture, there's different terms for it. It's basically a group of plants. So when you're designing a guild, you're designing a group of plants that function well together. So nitrogen fixers are really useful because you plant them in your guild, for example, in the understory of a fruit tree or a nut tree or something like that, and it'll take nitrogen out of the air, put it in the soil for the other plants to have. So they'll start working together.
I love it. What other plants are nitrogen fixers?
So the other nitrogen fixing plants, I believe the whole legume family, so peas and beans and different ones like that. And there are a lot of perennial versions of that. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, lupins, the classic wildflower with the beautiful tall purple flowers. Those are great. There's other plants. Okay, clovers, almost all clovers are nitrogen fixers as well. So that's a great one to spread throughout your landscape because they're often low growing. They're great pollinators. Most clovers have edible and medicinal properties, and then they're fixing nitrogen and building soil at the same time. So that's a great ground cover to put in your food forest. There's also another one of my favorite nitrogen fixers is called gumi. It's a gumi shrub. It's a pretty big shrub that will produce hundreds, or when it's large, thousands of tasty little berries. And it's also fixing nitrogen in the soil. So that's a powerful one because in permaculture, a lot of it's about stacking functions. So when you're designing a food forest guild or a food forest in general, one of the processes that I take my clients through is figuring out what their main values are and therefore what yields they want to get out of the guild. So oftentimes that's food, that's medicine, that's wildlife habitat, pollinator support, all sorts of different things. And a good food forest design can do all of that.
So yeah, there's these 7 layers of planting, right, that are included in food forest and perennial gardening. Can you talk more about that structure?
Absolutely. So when we look at a natural forest, there's often 7 different layers. And I believe that these refer to the trees, shrubs, vines, ground covers, herbaceous plants, and a few. So it's talking about plant structures, essentially. And so one of the ways that you design a food forest is by stacking plants vertically in a way that they support each other and fill different niches, but they don't overly compete with each other. So that's like a forest. You're going to see an upper canopy. In the Pacific Northwest, it's going to be the big leaf maples, the Douglas firs, the cedars, all those different trees that depend on the ecosystem. And then you can have the different shrub layers that are underneath that or around it, the herbaceous layers and the herbaceous plants. You have leafy plants, you have plants with large roots underneath. So understanding the plants and stacking those together in a way where they are working harmoniously. So, for example, at my house, I have my upper canopy is a large apple tree in one of the spots. And then underneath that, in a partly shady area, I have a red currant. And then nearby the currant, also underneath, is a comfrey plant. And then I also have clover spread around as nitrogen fixers. And just to use that guild as an example, from the apple tree, we're getting apples, obviously, and it also flowers. It supports pollinators. From the currant, it's similar. We're getting berries and pollinators. From the comfrey is often called the quintessential permaculture plant because it has so many different functions. So it's an amazing pollinator. You can eat the leaves. You can also make great medicine out of it. People make tea. It's also often referred to as the bone knit plant because you can make great poultices and other things that help heal ligament injuries and bone injuries. And it's also an amazing soil builder. It has this deep taproot. So it goes deep into the soil and pulls up minerals that are often hard to access and stores it in its leaves. And then you use a technique called chop and drop. And that technique is 2 to 3 times a year, depending on how fast your comfrey is growing. You can just cut the whole thing to the ground and mulch around it. And this comfrey will grow fast and the leaves will get 2 feet long, sometimes just huge leaves. And they're not woody, they're all herbaceous, so they'll break down very quickly. And that's a method of, first of all, building the organic matter percentage significantly, mulching the soil, so you're providing habitat for all the different critters and microscopic beings that live down there, and you're adding minerals to the soil that wouldn't normally happen. So that's a good example of how, when we manage it properly, we can speed up the successional process of nature. And I went on a tangent there with comfrey, but you can also see how the different layers are all stacked together in there, and they're all providing different functions.
It's a perfect example. And comfrey is just an amazing, amazing plant ally. So excited to hear about it being a quintessential permaculture plant ally.
Absolutely. I put it on underneath almost every tree guild. So like every time I have an upper canopy tree, and I'll say that depending on the situation, not everybody's going to have all 7 layers. That's an important piece to add. If you have a smaller garden, you're not going to have all 7 layers. And what the 7 layers teaches us is just, it all comes back to observing nature and just designing the plants in a way where they're supporting each other, but not competing, not competing in a harmful way. So, but that being said, I put comfrey under all of my tree plants, and we have so much comfrey at our house, and it's so fun to mulch it. So fun. It's so fun to chop and drop it and spread it around and just get huge wheelbarrows full, arms full of this amazing plant. And one of the other things that's just coming to mind, what this does is it often makes gardening fun. A lot of my clients are, they talk about yard work. I know it's like not that fun. Maybe we were all kids and we had to, weed the garden and we didn't want to. It's not that fun. And when you look at the state of landscaping and gardening, the conventional version today, it's really a sad state of affairs often, because there's a lot of people raking up their leaves. There's a lot of people using a variety of non-native plants, which can be fine, but also really non-functional plants. Plants that don't flower, plants that don't provide anything but, an appealing aesthetic for, I'd say, the kind of conventional person's enjoyment of the landscape. So it's often frustrating. A lot of that, you can trace the history back to a variety of places. If people want to learn, there's a great Freakonomics podcast about lawns, and it basically explains how some huge real estate developer, had, created a ton of homes where they put lawns in, and it somehow just took over the American mind and created this certain aesthetic that we've all learned to upkeep. And now there's a sort of cultural pressure to have it look a certain way and have the bare soil and have the plants shaped in the little balls and boxes. But that's really, when we connect both practically, to the importance of our landscape, we have the opportunity to gain food, to gain medicine, to support pollinators, to really have a deep connection, a deep practical and spiritual connection with our landscapes. So there's a popular quote in the permaculture world, which is all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. And I think that all of the world's problems can definitely be improved, whether that's our own health and wellness, whether that's this narrative of climate change or extinction, pollinator population declining, whether that's, even spiritual connection to a greater whole. One of the most positive effects that I've had is just being surrounded by abundance. There's an ability to sense the divine at a greater level. And one of the most beautiful parts of that is raising my children in the food forest as well. Because like I just said, there's all these different cultural narratives of the ways that the world is going and climate change. And there's a lot of fear related to the future. And a lot of them are true and founded, but it is totally different when children grow up surrounded by abundance and surrounded by solutions that they live in. The stories don't have as much power, and they don't carry as much fear. And it's a beautiful thing to see.
I really love that. Taking it back to the children, I have this deep vision and prayer that all public schools will use their land and create food forests. This has been a dream of mine for a very long time, where I think about like how big school properties are. Like the school I teach at, the property's massive, and the field is not really used for any type of quote unquote activity other than like, kids running and playing out there when they can, because some classrooms don't even really go out there to the big field. And so sometimes there's like after school stuff, but not really. And there's so many school properties that aren't really being utilized. It's just like this big field of grass. They're spraying all this glyphosate and really toxic, harmful chemicals to keep, the quote unquote weeds at bay, and to keep it looking like that really pristine, like you talked about how everybody had these like pristine manicured lawns, like that kind of traditional, conventional manicured lawn. Well, schools still model that. And I'm sure there's like amazing alternative schools or other schools doing great work where, they're incorporating gardens. And I've always been somebody who has worked with school gardens very closely, where I've done different garden programs. I've really put on a lot of work raising money for gardens, implementing gardens, writing grants for gardens. Like my whole thesis in graduate school was all about how garden-based education can help support the social emotional well-being of a child. Right. So I'm like so passionate about this. And like you said, when you show children the possibilities and the solutions to these greater, maybe these ideas about, climate change and how we really need to address, the issues that humans are causing on Earth, which we really do need to address. So many of, our pollution, how we're like creating water toxicity, what we're spraying on plants and the soil. We have so many things we need to address. But like you said, when we show children the possibility of solution, that scarcity mindset shifts and they can dream into a different future for themselves where there's enough abundance in food for all. We could reap the fruits that we sow. Everybody can live with enough. And it's just the way that we manage in these like systems that we have to kind of decolonize and reconstruct and rebuild and reimagine together. But I love just the connection to really showing our own children the possibilities and not being so much in the scarcity fear mindset. Yeah, I think that like gardens really can change the world. And I love the quote about how all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. I think that's really special. And I want to bring a quote that you said to me, and I shared this with you earlier. And it's from your own self, a voice message to me. And in this voice message, you said, "Food forests as a whole are the Garden of Eden recreated. This ticket to creating resilience and abundance and deep spiritual connection with the earth all at once." And I just have to say that quote hit me, and I think it's really profound. And I love that you're bringing in like these spiritual connections and alongside like the tending and living in reciprocity with the land. And I feel like so many of us, our stresses and our anxieties and our fears would really be diminished if only we put our hands in the dirt and our heart in the sun. So thank you for sharing your love of food forests with us in permaculture. And I want to talk about how if people are living in a suburban neighborhood and they wanted to build in these food forests, I want to hear about like what would be your process supporting people in doing that. And then also if people lived in an apartment or somewhere where they didn't have as much access to land, like you live on quite a bit of acreage. And I have, a small amount of acreage where I'm able to tend, but so many people have far less. What do you envision? What do you do? And I want to hear more about that work and your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. So I'll first start with the process. And the process that I use, and with everybody who works with me and the people can use on their own, especially if they grab that book, Practical Permaculture, it's 3 stages. And the first is a site assessment. And that is figuring out what are the constraints and opportunities of your property. And so we're looking at the different elements that move through the property. How does the sun move through? Where are the sunny spots? Where are the shady spots? How does water move through the property? Are there damp spots? Are there dry spots? How does wind move through the property? And then how does, and then the human parts of, are there needs for privacy in certain areas? Are there Do you live in an HOA? Are there regulations that you need to uphold? So really understanding what you're working with. And we want to understand what your property has so that we can then put the right things in the right places where they'll thrive naturally. We don't want to force certain plants in areas where they're not going to do well just because we like the plants. So the first step is site assessment. And the second step is concept design, which is a unique one where we're just determining the functional uses of spaces. So for example, I might say food forest over here, but I'm not getting into the specific plants yet. And that's useful for people to just think about the general use of the property. So we want a patio here for outdoor dining. We want a food forest over here. We want our raised beds for annual veggies over here. Maybe we want a trampoline or something like that over here. And then in the third stage, we go into the details of, okay, we want this specific plant right here. We want this gill to function right here. We want the irrigation lines to go over in this area. So that's the general process that I recommend to people. In summary, understand your site and then just work on large conceptual ideas and then drill down into the details there. So I think your second question after that was, what do people do if they have small spaces? Is that right? Or if they don't have a lot of acreage?
Yeah, like how can people start small, even in herbal or rental spaces, maybe?
Well, I will say that you can do a lot in a small space. If you go on YouTube, you can find all sorts of headlines. Family grows 5,000 pounds of food on a tenth of an acre, something like that. And if you search something like that, you'll see a lot of different techniques and strategies that people are using in small spaces. But if you don't have any space at all, then there are different opportunities for you. I'm thinking about a couple good resources right now. There's one called fallingfruit.org, and that's where people map public edible plants all around the world and even private ones. So sometimes people will have a fruit tree at their house that they're willing to share with people. And then if you click on it, it'll say apple tree. And then it might tell you like private, you have to ask the person if you want to be there. But in my experience, at least around the Seattle area here, there has been a ridiculous number of public edible plants out there that are fun for people to grab. The second resource is called Shared Earth. And it's a website that matches landowners with gardeners who want space. So for example, if you have a lot of space and it's a lot of maintenance, you can use this to find other people who don't have a lot of space and vice versa.
Those are all really great ideas.
Yeah, those are good ideas. And I also want to give a couple other resources to people. The other resources are a great website called plantsforfuture.org. It has this epic plant information where for every plant that you put into it, it will have the edible properties, the medicinal properties, the ecological uses and benefits, how to propagate it. That's edibility ratings, how tasty it is from 1 to 5. And then it has notations and resources for where it gets all of its information. So, a topic that I'd like to get into soon is useful perennial plants. And many people, almost every site assessment that I do, people already have edible plants on their property, edible or functional plants that they just don't know are edible. So if it feels good for you, kind of segue into the beauty of perennial vegetables and edible perennial plants.
Let's do it. I'm excited. Yeah. Tell us.
Okay. So perennial plants, I'll start with the large overview. They are amazing primarily because they are perennial. You plant them once and they come back every year with more yields and no maintenance. So I haven't checked this statistic in a while, but I think 80% of the food that we eat are annuals. So most people I talk to, the only perennials that they're familiar with are asparagus, rhubarb, and artichoke. Everybody knows those ones. But there are really hundreds of perennial vegetables here in the Pacific Northwest and all around the world. In the temperate climates, we are the king of vegetables. The tropics are the king of fruits. But up here, we're the king of vegetables. So we really have a lot. And we can both grow a lot of veggies and fruit. But if you live up here, you definitely want to learn to eat your veggies for sure. So perennial vegetables have the benefit of, like I said, they come back on their own. They can produce more yields with no maintenance. They often have more nutrition because when they're perennial, their roots have a chance to establish deeper layers year after year. They also generally have more functions than annual plants. So they might be a really good pollinator. They might have medicinal properties. They might have utilitarian properties of some sort also. So perennials are definitely, or perennial vegetables are definitely one of my passions. And for people that are familiar with plants here in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of plants that are edible that most people are familiar with. So my favorite perennial vegetable are daylilies. And daylilies are a common ornamental. When you start looking for them, you'll see them all over the place. And they're amazing because all parts of the plants are edible. The shoots are edible in spring, the flowers are edible in summer, and the bulbs are edible in winter. And they are drought tolerant, deer resistant, rabbit resistant, and cold hardy. So they're such a special plant. Another one, if it feels good, I can get into a few other kind of starter perennial vegetables for people that are feeling excited about this. Another one is hostas. So hostas is another one of those where I talk to clients all the time. They go, hostas, I had no idea that was edible. That's amazing. And over in Asia, it's a popular vegetable, and all hostas are edible, all the different styles. And this is one that you'll commonly find in nursery, a bunch of different varieties. And the shoots in spring that pop up, they're like an asparagus substitute. I think hosta might actually be related to asparagus. I think they're as tasty as asparagus, but you want to harvest them right before they unravel, and then you can roast them in the oven or saute them, and they taste delicious. You can also eat the leaves, toss them in a mixed salad in summer as well. Another one of my favorites is sweet cicely. It's a beautiful plant. It has licorice tasting leaves. It has these majestic white umbel flowers, and it's just a wonderful plant all around. Another one of my top favorites is groundnut, and I believe it's native to North America, but this is a vine that has tuberous roots. So it's a beautiful vine. It produces this string of edible roots that are kind of potato sized. And if your soil's really good, sometimes they can be the size of your fist. And they taste similar to potatoes, but they have 3 times the protein. And they're more cold hardy than potatoes. So you can just leave them in the ground over winter and harvest them whenever you want to eat them. And they're also a nitrogen fixing vine. So you can, as we discussed in guilds earlier, you can place this. I often plant it among Jerusalem artichokes or other plants that get really tall and strong. So it's similar to the Three Sisters technique that people know about from the Native Americans, where in that one, you have corn as the tall stalk. You have beans running up the corn, use the corn as a trellis, and then the beans are nitrogen fixing, so they build the soil. Then at the bottom, I believe they had squash, which kind of covers the soil and protects it from the sun. So groundnut, that's a really positive one. I'll say 2 more of my favorites. Muskmallow is one I definitely recommend people get into. This is a perennial lettuce, essentially, that has edible leaves and edible flowers. And it's really a great starter for people because the best starter plants are ones that you can say, oh, you're just going to use this like lettuce. Like this is going to be, you're going to use it as a bulk leaf in your salads, because then there's not a lot of time that you have to learn to use to cook with it and work with it. So this one's really great. And then Turkish rocket is another one of my favorites, and that has these amazing shoots that are like broccoli, and they kind of have a popcorn taste when you saute them. I saute them in coconut oil, and they taste like popcorn, and they will send these shoots up for often 2 months straight. And so when you have a small patch of it, you can have these kind of broccoli type flower shoots for months, and it's really fun. So those would be my top ones that I recommend for people that are just getting started.
That's amazing. It sounds so fun to work with, and some I'm familiar with and some are new for me. And I'm looking forward to incorporating more of those food forest foods and perennial foods into my own gardening experience, because I am somebody who grows a lot of annuals. That's just how I started gardening. Like with my mom when I was young, she'd like tend to her, annuals. And of course they had like the yard space, but like, some garden boxes, tending to those, and my own gardening experience. I've grown a lot of, yeah, annuals, but I've also grown some perennials and have a big connection to that too, but less so than the annuals. It's more so like, oh, it's in the yard and maybe I'm not eating it and maybe I'm not utilizing it how I could to be sustaining myself more and my family off the land that we live off of. So,
Yeah, in defense of annuals, a lot of these plants have been bred to be really delicious or to have large fruits, and humans have put a lot of time and effort into making them this wonderful food that we all like to eat. So I definitely have garden beds where I like to grow a lot of annuals and incorporate a lot of the normal dishes. And then it's also fun to incorporate all the perennials as well and to have a mix of them. And it ultimately makes you feel really rich because there's all these amazing delicacies and amazing plants that you can eat that you really can't buy anywhere unless you're growing yourself. And I've talked a lot about vegetables, but this also goes into fruit. There's a ton of amazing fruit that we can grow. All the usuals, the strawberries, the blueberries, the raspberries, but then you can get into gooseberries, josta berries, goomy berries, and a ton
kiwi
of other
berries.
kiwi berries. Yeah, figs work well up here, and you can really have a lot of special plants.
Yeah, so it can be quite abundant, which I want to talk about community resilience in terms of like I want to talk about the connection between permaculture and community resilience. So, because this, like you said, these perennial gardens, these food forests, we can make a Garden of Eden on earth where everybody has enough, there's abundance, and you feel, like you said, really rich, really wealthy in food, and you feel really sustained. So, what are your thoughts between permaculture and community resilience?
That's a great question, and you could really take it a number of ways. I know my initial thoughts are that one of the things that humans love to do the most is eat together. And it's really an amazing ritual, and it brings people together, and it allows us to spend some close time together. And the other thing that it does is really connects us to place and connects us to our land. So when we are using these permaculture principles, then we often have a significantly larger amount of rituals that are place-based and that are working with nature and working together. And a lot of these principles, when they're used in action, tend towards kind of localized systems as opposed to, these large industrial international systems. So they really bring people together in a beautiful way. I also think that there's more creative expression when we are working with the land together. And it's funny, it makes me think of this poster that's in my house that I moved into, where it's a poster of Thailand, I believe, and of all the different cultures in the different areas of Thailand. And all around the outskirts are these beautiful kind of pictures of indigenous people, and they all have different beads and art and symbols that you can tell are meaningful to them. And then in one of the large cities, there's like a city dweller guy. He just had like his tie on, and he looked like any other city dweller in the rest of the world. And I'm not putting down that lifestyle because I've obviously benefited from it so much, and so many other people have. And we get to enjoy these delicacies from all around the world and efficiencies and productivity. But it's made me think of how when everything becomes standardized and when we're all just operating with larger international franchises, different things, it seems to stifle some of our creative expression, like individual and shared creative expression. So what permaculture often does for community is it like brings us together and centers us around place, which is going to be different for everybody depending on what your ecosystem is. Maybe it's just fun to think about, the Vikings of the North who are tough from all the cold and eat all their meat and potatoes and different things. And then the different warmer regions who have a lot of fruit, and the ecosystems, when you really reflect on it, really create unique people and unique cultures. So it's a great question that I haven't fully articulated out loud before, but I think there's many different ways that it brings people together.
I love your thoughts about how it really inspires creativity, and it's a reflection of our own environment, right? Like we're mirroring when you're living in reciprocity with land, when you're tending to it, and it's tending to you, like you're mirroring the beauty that it's mirroring to you. And so when you're bringing in talking about different cultures and how like the land, it really does shape the way that you express and the activities that you do and so much. So it really does create different pockets of communal living and culture. And that's a beautiful way to see that through permaculture and tending the land. So thanks for sharing that. It took me to a lot of great places in my mind. I studied anthropology when I was in my undergrad. And so I often think about cross-cultural connections. And I love thinking about land and place and how that has created different cultures and ways of being and living. And that's something I actually teach to my fourth graders. We talk about how does land shape culture and how does the resources that we have, how does it shape our culture? And that's a really fascinating thing to reflect on for young people. Yeah. I want to circle back to a point from way earlier, talking about the vision of school yards and turning them into food forests or perennial gardens. Like, wow, just can you imagine what a beautiful community space that would be if all of the neighborhood children were tending this piece of land and also receiving the not just spiritual benefit of tending land, but, just food, access to food. So in places where I teach with an urban population in a pocket that's high poverty. And I just think about how much abundance that could bring and how much magic that could bring into the community if the land was being utilized in a good way like that, and how much resilience that would create in a people. And my whole thing has always been like the most powerful thing you can do is grow your own food. And I feel like that really empowers kids when you teach them how to tend a garden and work with the land. Like that is place-based living, that is survival living, and that is more so aligned with our original instructions as humans on the earth.
I couldn't agree more. And we really have these huge opportunities to make our educational institutions these centers of amazing abundance. And if we can do that, then it would radically shift, the health and well-being of our children and our future. So I definitely share that dream of having gardens and food forests in all the schools that we can, where kids learn the plants, they learn how to grow it, how to harvest it, how to tend to it, how to propagate plants so they can propagate them and take them home and spread them throughout their community, really learn how to create abundance and share and spread abundance.
It's such a beautiful vision. And I really want to see that in my lifetime. I really want to work towards that in my life and really feed that possibility because it is there. And it's just about getting enough people educated and aware of the benefits and how it could better serve, because school gardens, you could teach anything through a school garden. I mean, it hits every single quote unquote common core state standard if you're following those, which most states have adopted those standards. But anything you could teach any subject area in a garden. And so that is the beauty of it. If, in place-based education, what it really does for children and like the resilience of culture and community, it has me very excited. And so I hope that in your work, Healthy Homestead Designs can start working with schools, because that would be pretty incredible. And I hope that we can start putting more resources into that evolution happening for us and for our children and just the health of society as a whole. We're in early spring right now. I like having these episodes be really cyclically minded. And so for listeners at home who might not be able to hire out working with a permaculture firm like yours, and they might just, not have the capacity, the financial ability, or whatever that may be, what are some early spring tasks or projects that listeners could start in their gardens right now for themselves?
I would say that I would first say for people to follow their excitement. When you think about gardening, what are you most excited about? You want those fresh, juicy tomatoes or blueberries or strawberries, or like me, are you really curious about these type of perennials, unique edible perennials. So I would first follow that. The general spring tasks are kind of preparing your garden beds and preparing, getting them ready for seed planting or for supporting your perennials. One thing I would encourage everyone to do, especially if they're excited about food forests, is to get a plant identification app. The one that I really like is Picture This. And if you don't know all of your plants, go identify all the plants that are already on your property or in your neighborhood or in surrounding areas. So identify all the plants. And then once you've done that, put them all into the Plants for a Future website. And I bet that you will find that there are some special plants that already have a lot of offerings on your land or nearby. I would say 90% of my clients' homes that I go to site assessment for already have some functional plants. Right now in the Pacific Northwest, there are a ton of shoots coming up, and nettles have popped up. Hosta shoots, Solomon seal shoots, all the different things, big leaf maple flowers, which are edible. Those are starting to open and come out. And so I would encourage you to see what's already coming up and start learning to follow the rhythm of nature. That's one of the biggest pieces for both health and grounding, is to figure out where is nature's energy. So right now in spring, it's in all the new shoots and all the vegetative growth. And then in summer, it's going to be in the flowers and more vegetative growth. In the fall, it's going to be in the fruit. In the winter, it's going to be in the roots. And we really return to the cyclical seasonal living, then we are kind of in tune with where nature is putting her energy. So for spring right now, I guess to summarize, I would say prepare your garden beds. I know we've talked a lot about food forests, but annuals are awesome. If you're going to plant your lettuce, your tomatoes, all those things. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we're almost past our regular last frost, where you should be able to plant just about anything in the ground. So get your garden beds ready, learn about the plants that you already have that are nearby, and follow your joy, whatever brings you the most passion right now.
Amazing. I love that advice. I love how you talked about getting to know what's coming up near you. And if you're someone listening who doesn't have a yard or that much in their yard, or you're living in maybe a suburban neighborhood and the yards are all very conventional style, grass and whatnot, then going out into your local forest, going for a hike and seeing what nature's doing, like you said. And I just harvested nettle again yesterday with my daughter, and I went to this new forest near where we live that I had never heard of before. And it's a nature conservation area. And I was just blown away at the beauty. It was pretty old growth forest, huge old maples, huge Douglas firs, huge cedars as a top canopy, and then seeing all of the shrubs and everything going around. I was like, oh, there's miner's lettuce, there's nettle everywhere. There's so many things growing. And it was just very exciting for me to go take Sequoia and see all the things. And the salmon berries are flowering and Indian plum is growing, and just watching and looking at everyone. And I love thinking about, okay, looking at what is nature doing naturally in the scapes of where you live, and then what can you integrate into your own land and place and just pull that in. And I love the small steps of just like, yeah, going out and seeing and seeing what is also available in your property. Because sometimes when I think about if someone was hiring a permaculture design firm to work with them in their yard, I think, whoa, it's a whole new yard. You're going to have this whole new thing. And what I'm hearing you say is like, you can utilize a lot of what's already growing, as people don't really realize maybe the medicinal benefit or what it's doing for the land, and that you can still, it's a usable resource and really works well, and you don't have to totally rip everything out and start anew. Like you can really build with what you have. And so that was really cool to learn.
Absolutely. And the other advice that came to me while you're talking is to plug yourself into some local groups, some gardening groups or permaculture groups. The gardening world and permaculture world is so generous because when it's really functioning well, you have so much abundance. Everybody wants to share. So there's a lot of knowledge and inspiration to be gained from that as well.
That's a great idea. And do most places where people live, are there permaculture groups to join?
I would say so. It's definitely big in the Pacific Northwest. And when I do assessments for clients in different parts of the world or the nation, I can almost always find local groups there. So there's a lot of exciting groups out there. And even places like Seattle, we now have something called the Beacon Food Forest, which is, one of the nation's first public food forests that I believe was granted by the city. And it's pretty large and it's been popular. So there's definitely growing opportunities.
That's amazing. So in the Beacon Food Forest, people can just go and harvest what they want.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can go and harvest anything. It's public for everybody, and there are volunteer work parties where people go tend to it. And so far, it's been a big success. A lot of things have been harvested, and the community at large has really enjoyed it.
That's amazing. That's like what we can dream up to happen on school properties.
Yeah.
Is like doing what Beacon Food Forest has done for having these public spaces where everyone's tending and supporting and benefiting, and how generous it could all become because we really mirror the land. And when the land is generous, the people are generous. So I love that, like in the permaculture community, how there's a lot of generosity in that. I think that makes a lot of sense in my mind. Yeah, and that sharing. So we're coming up on time here, and I'm curious, how can listeners connect with Healthy Homestead Designs or work with you, and what are your current offerings?
So you can connect with me through Facebook or Instagram at Healthy Homestead Design. And if you want to work with me, you can reach out through there or through my website. There's a submission form. And my current offerings are design, installation, and maintenance. We are really trying to support everybody at whatever gardening journey they're at. So some people just want to design and then they want to install it themselves. And that's great. And other people are really busy and they just want to walk out their door and harvest fresh food. So we can do the installation and we can maintain it for you as well. And I like to tell people that my mission in starting the business is that people can harvest from their food forest as easily as they can go to the store right now. And I was kind of inspired to come up with that one day because I heard the definition of a culture is a bunch of people doing the same thing. That's kind of what a culture is. And I think a culture where we're all harvesting from food forests would actualize that quote that I mentioned towards the beginning by Toby Hemingway, that permaculture allows us to move from a culture of fear and scarcity to love and abundance.
Thank you. I love that. Any last words of encouragement for someone who's just beginning their journey into homesteading, gardening, or earth-connected living?
That's a great question. I would just say get growing. Don't get paralysis by analysis. Just do what you think works. The garden's not going to be perfect right away. Even the perennials, I still move them around in my garden. Think, oh, it'll work better over here. Just got to start learning and start growing.
Yes, I love that. And I love to how sometimes you just change things and that's okay. Like I think we just told you we moved the sea kale you gave us years ago. It was in this one garden spot for a couple years and then we moved it to a completely new spot and it's thriving. It's starting to really shoot up and you can move around and play around and just start somewhere, and small is enough. And I love what makes a culture. And if we all were harvesting from our land more and sharing that wisdom with each other and modeling that for each other, I just see a lot of beauty and abundance to come for all human people if we live that way. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. And I just want to leave people with a little inspiration. I remember I lived in a house in Shoreline, Washington for a long time. And there was a neighbor on the corner that had this 30 or 40-year-old fig tree. And it would produce thousands of figs. And we had about 200 homes in our neighborhood. And I just remember it was enough for the entire neighborhood to eat. It was 30 by 30 feet, this fig tree. And it was just a challenge to not, let too much drop off the tree. So it was, and I thought if we could all even have one fruit tree in our backyard that we could share, then we could really get to this point of abundance and connectivity fairly quickly.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, B, for all your wisdom and for coming on this podcast and sharing your heart.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's been really fun to talk about permaculture and share this time with you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for walking this path of holistic wellness and mindful living with me. I hope today's discussion planted seeds in the hearts of those that need it most and has inspired you in some way. If you found value in our conversation, please consider subscribing to the Sacred Rite podcast and leaving a review. It really helps this podcast reach more listeners, and I would be so grateful. I would love to connect over social media. My Instagram handle is @sacred.rite. There you can stay up to date on upcoming episodes, current offerings, and small batch releases of our handmade botanical remedies. I will leave any relevant links from today's episode in the show notes. The music in this podcast is from an incredible musician and a dear sister of mine, Satori Key. Be sure to check out her music on all major platforms. Her medicine music is transformative and deeply healing and has truly changed my life. Tune in next time. Until then, nurture your body and soul, and remember, it's your sacred right.